In our last class, I threatened Luke Tribble, and I want the people who are watching this recording to know that that was in jest. I really will not walk back there and slap him in the side of the head if he asks me a question like that again. But that is a question that we'll cover in Godhead class. And Luke was not offended by that, for anybody who's watching this video.
Amen.
So we had finished up in our outline, and this is on page 34 of the syllabus outline, the prophet Joel. And in 2 Chronicles 24, at this very time in the text, and we only find this in 2 Chronicles 24, that a prophet of God is going to be stoned, and this is in the southern kingdom of Judah, which is a terrible, it's terrible whether it's the northern kingdom of Israel or southern kingdom of Judah. But in 2 Chronicles 24, verses 20 through 22, says, Then the Spirit of God came on Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest. Now remember, Jehoiada is the priest, and Jehoshaphat, his wife, were the ones who took this baby, Joab,
in Athaliah, and he was doing good as long as Jehoiada, the high priest, was alive. But as soon as Jehoiada died, then everything started falling apart. And so now you've got Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, in 2 Chronicles 24, beginning verse 20. It says, He stood above the people and said to them, Thus God has said, Why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord and do not prosper? And so again, we find the material wealth of the people is being withheld by God as a matter of discipline. It's the only thing they understand. And of course, really, it's the only thing we really understand. Generally, when we transgress the speed limit and we're fined a very heavy fine, we then from that point on, at least on that particular street, have a tendency to slow down. But it's only because we were fined a large amount. If we were just stopped and said, now, you know you're not supposed to do that, so don't do that anymore, that probably wouldn't have as much effect as taking some money out of your wallet. So God deals with the people by taking away their food and their prosperity. So that's exactly what Zechariah is saying. Why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord and do not prosper? You know, he links them together. You transgress the commandments of the Lord, you do not prosper. And that was the way that God meted out physical discipline for the Jews within the Old Testament. Now, as time has gone on, there's no way that we can determine that is what it's doing when different areas of the world are no longer prospering or there's famine. Unless it's written in the Scripture, we just don't make the case. It could be, but again, there's no way to know for sure. He says, because you have forsaken the Lord, He has also forsaken you. So that's right there in verse 20, and that's the explanation. You walked away from God. Because you walked away from God, God has forsaken you. Now, God could be just standing still, and we turn around and go in the opposite direction. Well, we're the ones that have determined that we're going to walk away from God. God's not walking away from us. We're distancing ourselves from God. So, he says, because you have forsaken the Lord, He has also forsaken you. So they conspired against Him in verse 21. All of this just shows how far this young King Joash has come in getting away from the teachings of Jehoiada. And this is the son of Jehoiada. They may have been playmates when they were growing up. So they conspired against him, and at the command of the king, they stoned him to death in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash the king did not remember the kindness
which his father Jehoiada had shown him, but he murdered, there it is, he murdered his son. And as he died, he said, may the Lord see and avenge. It's not exactly like, forgive them, Lord, they know not what they do. This is more like, God, I leave it in your hands. I can't do anything about this. I'm going to die, and that's not an improper thing to do because it is left in God's hands, but it's just a remark that would have been heard by the ones who were stoning. In other words, my blood is on their hands, and God, you'll take care of it, and God does take care of it. Now, as you're noting in the syllabus, along with Judah, you'll note that Hazael's army marches into Judah. Now, these are the Syrians, and the Syrians are generally giving problems to the northern kingdom of Israel. But here they march into Judah. But if you look over on the other side, if you look at the northern kingdom of Israel, the syllabus, you'll see in 2 Kings 13, if you go back to 2 Kings 13, that the Syrians are really on a roll as far as conquering land, and they've really worked their way down through the northern kingdom of Israel. So in 2 Kings 13, and noting verse 4, says, then Jehoahaz entreated the favor of the Lord, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw the oppression of Israel, how the king of Aram oppressed them. So earlier, at least Jehoahaz of Israel has gone to God and has repented, and that's unusual for any of those northern kings to do anything like that. And then you'll note in 2 Kings 13, verse 7, for he left to Jehoahaz of the army not more than 50 horsemen and 10 chariots and 10,000 footmen, for the king of Aram had destroyed them and made them like the dust at threshing. Well, the dust at threshing is just that cloud of dust that's raised when they're threshing the wheat, and it then settles down, and of course the dust isn't good for anything. But Hazael is marching through Israel, that's the kingdom to the north, and now in 2 Chronicles 24, verses 23 and 24, we see that he's marched all the way down into Judah. Verse 23 says, and this is 2 Chronicles 24, I came about at the turn of the year that the army of the Arameans came up against him, and they came to Judah and Jerusalem, destroyed all the officials of the people from among the people, sent all their spoil to the king of Damascus. And then in verse 24 it says, indeed the army of the Arameans came with a small number of men, yet the Lord delivered. So that's an important point to note right there. This is God's discipline once again. So these are the individuals that killed the prophet Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada. These are the people that when Zechariah died, he said, may the Lord see and avenge, back in verse 23 or verse 22. And sure enough, right here in verses 23 and 24, the Syrians have come all the way to the land. Now, is it possible that had they not murdered Zechariah, is it possible that they'd remained with the Lord? Very possible. The Syrians would have never made it that far. But it says in verse 24, indeed the army of the Arameans came with a small number of men, so indicating that God can do great things with small numbers of individuals. We saw that earlier on in the book of Judges when we're looking at Gideon, who starts out with a large number and ends up with only 300 individuals in order that the victory might not go to the glory of Gideon, but might go to the glory of God. And so it says, yet the Lord delivered a very great army. That would be the army of Judah, a very great army, into their hands because they had forsaken the Lord. That's Judah, the God of their fathers. Thus they executed judgment on Joash. So there's that young King Joash, and he is being disciplined as a result of all this, and it's Haziel. So that's subpoint number 2 under Judah on page 34 in your syllabus. 2 Kings 12, go back to 2 Kings 12, we're just noting some passages that are not noted in the Kings section, but are noted in the Chronicles section. 2 Kings 12, we come back to verse 17, and it says, Then Hazael, king of Aram, went up and fought against Gath and captured it. Well, Gath is not an Israelite city. Gath is one of the Philistine city-states. So this Syrian army is one that has a great power. Of course, God is using this people, the Syrians. And then in 2 Kings 12, verse 17b, Joash pays tribute to Hazael. It says, And Hazael set his face to go up to Jerusalem. So he's taken Gath. I guess he figures, if I can take Gath, I can take Jerusalem. And then in verse 18 it says, And Joash, king of Judah, or Jehoash, took all the sacred things that Jehoshaphat and Jehoram and Ahaziah, his father's kings of Judah, had dedicated, and his own sacred things, and all the gold that was found among the treasuries of the house of the Lord and of the king's house, and sent them to Hazael, king of Aram. Then he went away from Jerusalem. So he pays tribute. But do you see anywhere that he goes to God? No. He doesn't go to God. He just tries to buy him off in a very worldly way, and it works for the moment. And then you'll note over on the bottom of the syllabus there it notes Jehoahaz, that's the king of Israel. In 2 Kings 13, verses 8 and 9, says, Now the rest of the acts of Jehoahaz, all that he did in his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Jehoahaz slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria. So that's the end of Jehoahaz of Israel. Now we're still dealing with Joash of Judah, and look at the name of the next king of Israel, just to confuse matters a little bit. It's another Joash, or Jehoash. So on page 35 of the syllabus, the points to remember in Jehoahaz's reign: he's oppressed by Syria, he calls on the Lord, a deliverer is promised. But then Jehoash, who is going to reign after him, comes to the throne in 2 Kings 13, verses 9b and 10. And Joash, that's what it's noting here in the 2 Kings 13, verse 9. Joash, this is Joash of Israel, not Joash of Judah. Joash's son became king in his place in the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah. There it is, verses 9 and 10 can really get you confused. I mean, both these guys are named Joash? Yeah, they're both named Joash. In the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, became king over Israel and Samaria and reigned for 16 years. His character is a foregone conclusion because he's a king of Israel. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not turn away from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, with which he made Israel sin, but he walked in them. And then in verses 14 and 15, we're going to see Elisha. And this is Elisha's deathbed prophecy, and then we're going to see the death of Elisha. When Elisha, and by the way, when you're looking at verse 14 right here in 2 Kings 13, verse 14, you might put a side note that the last time we saw Elisha was back in chapter 9, verse 1, and that was 45 years before this time. So we've had a period of time go by. 45 years have gone by, and now Elisha comes on the scene one last time. says, when Elisha became sick with the illness of which he was to die, Joash, the king of Israel, and this is this new king who's going to reign for 16 years, came down to him and wept over him and said, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And this is just a term that we had seen even earlier on. We'd seen it back in chapter 2 and verse 12, when Elisha watches Elijah ascend out of his sight. Elisha in 1 Kings 2 verse 12, Elisha saw it and cried out, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And that's just some sort of term that was a traditional term that was used. And he saw him no more. And now this same term is being used right here by the king of Israel, who is a wicked king, but he's come to Elisha, probably trying to figure out what can I receive from Elisha before he dies. And so he says, my father, that's just a spiritual father. That's the way it was used back in chapter 2, verse 12. My father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. In other words, the might and power of Israel. And Elisha said to him in verse 15, take a bow and arrows. He doesn't say how many arrows. So he took a bow and arrows. In other words, more than one. Then he said to the king of Israel, put your hand on the bow. And that means get ready to stretch the bow. And he put his hand on it. Then Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands. So as the bow is already strung, he puts in the arrow. Then he said, open the window, shoot toward the east. Now shooting toward the east is toward Syria. That's where all the problems are from. Syria. Like the last time the Syrians came through with Hazael, they not only went through Israel, but they went down into Judah. So open the window toward the east, and he opened it. Then Elisha said, shoot, and he shot. And he said, the Lord's arrow of victory, even the arrow of victory over Aram, for you shall defeat the Arameans at Aphek until you have destroyed them. Then he said, verse 18, this isn't the end of it, take the arrows. Now one would assume that this would be the rest of the arrows on hand. Take the arrows, and he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, strike the ground. Probably shoot the arrows. Strike the ground. And he struck it 3 times and stopped. Now the indication is he had more arrows than that. But he only did it 3 times. So the man of God was angry with him and said, you should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck Aram until you would have destroyed it. But now you should strike Aram only 3 times. So there's a lack of faith on the part. Elisha told him, take the arrows, shoot the arrows, and he just did 3 more. Maybe he said, I'm getting a little bit tired of shooting arrows through the open window. And he shouldn't have done that. So he'll pay the consequences for that. And so in verse 20a, and Elisha died, and they buried him. Now, verse 20b, we're going to see a little bit later on, because chronologically, this doesn't take place when they buried Elisha. In other words, there's going to be a miracle in Elisha's tomb that's going to be seen a little bit later in chronological order. Now, if you come over to Judah, you'll see that we're going to get rid of that Joash, so that'll make life a little bit less complicated for us. In 2 Kings 12 and verse 20, it says, and his servants rose and made a conspiracy and struck down Joash at the house of Milo as he was going down to Selah. So it talks about the assassination, and it was an attempt that was successful. And in verse 21a, for Josiah the son of Shimeath, and Jehozabad the son of Shomer, his servants, struck him, and he died. Then it goes on to note that verse 19, now the rest of the acts of Joash and all he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And so the points to remember in Joash's reign, he's the only seed royal not slain by Athaliah. And he did right while he was led by Jehoiada the priest. In fact, he even repaired the temple. But then, as soon as Jehoiada the priest died, then he was no longer a good, faithful king. And so that's the end of Joash of Judah. So we come to king number 9 in Judah. We just looked at king number 13 in Israel. And this king is going to be Amaziah. He's going to reign for 29 years. This is of Judah. And he comes to the throne in 2 Kings 12, verse 21b. Amaziah's son became king in his place. And if you come down to chapter 14, verses 1 and 2, in the second year of Joash, son of Joahaz, king of Israel, Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, became king. He was 25 years old and became king. He reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jehoiadan of Jerusalem. And so he is going to reign, verses 3 through 6. This is the king of Judah, so we may get a good one this time. He did right in the sight of the Lord, yet not like David his father. He did according to all that Joash his father had done. So, counting all the good things that Joash his father had done. But what was it he didn't do? Only the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. These, of course, are the high places that people would conveniently use for the worship of God. And he just didn't take any of that away from the people. He should have, but he didn't. Verse 5, it says, now it came about as soon as the kingdom was firmly in his hand, that he killed his servants who had slain the king his father. So those servants that we noted back in 2 Kings 12 and verse 20, they were brought to justice, and they were taken care of. Actually, 2 Kings 12, verses 20 and 21. Verse 6, but the sons he did not put to death. And that's unusual because usually the whole of the family would be wiped out. But the sons of the slayers he did not put to death, according to what is written in the book of the law of Moses, as the Lord commanded, saying, the father shall not be put to death for the sons, nor the sons be put to death for the fathers, but each shall be put to death for his own sin. And so anytime that was done, that was a very worldly thing that they were doing, where they were wiping out the whole family. And in this particular case, God didn't want that to be done. The law did not require that to be done. In fact, actually, the law provided a protection for the rest of the family. So that's Amaziah. And Amaziah is going to march against Edom, if you'll note your outline there under Judah, 2 Chronicles 25, verse 5. Meanwhile, if you look over at the Israel side, remember that we just left Elisha dying. So sometime into the reign of Amaziah, and sometime further along in the reign of Joash of Israel, something happens here in 2 Kings 13 and verse 20b. It says in verse 20b, now the bands of the Moabites would invade the land in the spring of the year, verse 21, and as they were burying a man, behold, they saw a marauding band, and these would be the Syrians, and they cast the man into the grave of Elisha. And when the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood up on his feet. And so there's the miracle in Elisha's tomb is taking place in verses 20b and 21. So took a little bit further along after, because it says that they cast the man into the grave of Elisha, and that's probably not an open pit, but probably a grave that's been hewn out of the rock. Remember, this part of the world is more rock than soil, and so graves, remember the grave of Joseph of Arimathea? It was a carved grave. In other words, the tomb was cut out of the rock, and the body was laid in, then a stone was rolled over the entrance to the tomb. So that's probably what we're looking at right here. And they just found that tomb, and they threw that one who had died into that tomb, and when the man touched the bones, so whatever time it would have taken for the flesh to rot off, all that was left were the bones of Elisha. But as soon as he touched the bones of Elisha, he had an immediate healing. So you come down to 2 Kings 13, still looking at 2 Kings 13, and look at verses 23 through 25. The Lord was gracious to them. Now this is Hazael, verse 22, king of Aram, had oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz. The Lord was gracious to them, gracious to Israel, had compassion on them, and turned to them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them or cast them from his presence until now. Now, the until now, you need to understand that that's talking about the time of the writing. And the time of the writing, the time of the end of the writing of 2 Kings, takes place at the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. So when he says until now, he's talking about the until now would be that time of Babylonian destruction. When Hazael, king of Aram, died, Ben-Hadad, his son, became king in his place. Then Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, took again from the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities which he had taken in war from the hand of Jehoahaz, his father. 3 times Joash defeated him. What's the 3 times?
The stone with the arrows.
The arrow, yeah, the arrows. 3 times, not going to be 4 times. 3 times Joash defeated him and recovered the cities of Israel. Could have done more than that, but just 3.
Just to go back for a moment to the miracle at Elijah's tomb, do you suppose it's accounts like that gave rise to the whole relic ideology, that if we find these relics, they still have power or they're divine in some way?
That's part of it. And of course that becomes very, in more modern times, very Catholic, that something's going to happen if you're there. You get the sun can do strange things to a screen door where it looks like there's the figure of Mary at the screen door, and so that will attract crowds from all over the place. So that sadly is still a part of that particular religious body today. Well, Amaziah is going to march against Edom there in 2 Chronicles 25, verse 5 in your outline on page 36. And Amaziah is going to hire 100,000 mercenaries out of Israel. Now, that's an interesting situation, because he feels like he doesn't have enough to go against Edom, which means, obviously, he's not gone to God to figure out what God will do. He doesn't even ask God for permission. You look at 2 Chronicles 25, verse 5, it says, moreover, Amaziah assembled Judah and appointed them according to their fathers' households under commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds throughout Judah and Benjamin. He took a census of those from 20 years old and upward, and he found them to be 300,000 choice men able to go to war and handle the spear and shield. Now, he doesn't take those 300,000 and go to God and say, I'm going to go against Edom. He should have said, can I go against Edom? And then number two, what will be the plan of attack if I do go against Edom? In other words, with 300,000. But he leaves God completely out of the picture. God's not even considered in any of this. And so in 2 Chronicles 25, verse 6, he hired also 100,000 valiant warriors out of Israel for 100 talents of silver. So when you're hiring someone, and especially when you're hiring the ungodly, that means you have no trust in what God will do for you. So this is a trust faith issue for Amaziah. He's already got about 300,000 out of Judah. He's going to hire another 100,000 out of Israel to go against Edom, and you still don't have him going to God. But in 2 Chronicles 25, verses 7 through 9, says, but a man of God came to him saying, and as you're reading this, you're thinking, well, he's not going to go to God. What's God going to do? Is God going to intervene? And sure enough, here it is. But a man of God came to him saying, O king, do not let the army of Israel go with you, for the Lord is not with Israel, nor with any of the sons of Ephraim. So God is not with the ungodly Jews in the northern kingdom of Israel. So he says, and God doesn't raise any objection, does not raise any objection until it comes to the raising of 100,000 mercenaries out of the northern kingdom of Israel. So the man of God, this is one of God's prophets, says, God says, don't take the 100,000. Verse 8, but if you do go, do it, be strong for the battle, yet God will bring you down before the enemy, for God has power to help and to bring down. So verse 8, you're really doomed to failure. You should have gone to God to begin with. 100,000 men will not help you. It's just going to compound the problem. Verse 9, and Amaziah said to the man of God, but what shall we do for the 100 talents which I have given to the troops of Israel? And the man of God answered, the Lord has much more to give you than this. Then Amaziah dismissed them, the troops which came to him from Ephraim, to go home. So their anger burned against Judah, and they returned home in fierce anger. Now, how's come? He dismisses 100,000 mercenaries. He's already paid them. 100 talents, and it doesn't say whether it's, and that's a measurement, that's weight. It doesn't say whether that's silver or gold or what. Already paid him 100 talents, and God says, I told you to let him go. I mean, I can either give you the victory, or I can have you fall and be defeated. I mean, I'm the one who takes care of all that. The 100,000, they're not going to do anything for you except cause more difficulty. Now, why would the 100,000 mercenaries, who have already been paid off, go back home angry?
Right.
Could be.
They can't get the stuff from the people they're going to kill.
That's right. So there's not going to be any spoils of war.
So since there are no spoils of war, they're angry. And besides, that 100 talents probably didn't go to any of them, but probably went to their commanders, who salted it away in the Swiss bank account someplace. Oh, wait a minute, I sort of jumped into today's individuals, didn't I? So they go away, they're in fierce anger, and then Amaziah is going to go against Edom, here in 2 Chronicles 25, verses 11 and 12. Now Amaziah strengthened himself and led his people forth, went to the valley of Salt, struck down 10,000 of the sons of Seir. That's just another term for Edom. It's Mount Seir, which is in Edom. The sons of Judah also captured 10,000 alive, brought them to the top of the cliff, threw them down from the top of the cliff so that they were all dashed to pieces. So Amaziah has a victory. Meanwhile, as we go to page 37, the dismissed Israelites pillaged the cities of Judah. So on their way back home, since they couldn't get any spoil from the Syrians that they've been hired to fight, well, we'll just go ahead and ravage the land on our way back home. And when we cross the border back into the northern kingdom of Israel, we'll have some of the spoil, but it won't be Syrian spoil. It'll be, of course, from their brethren. So in 2 Chronicles 25 and verse 13, but the troops whom Amaziah had sent back from going with him to battle raided the cities of Judah from Samaria to Beth Horon, struck down 3,000 of them, and plundered much spoil. So that's what happens when you're dealing with an ungodly, unrighteous people. Even though you've paid them, they, of course, thought that they were going to get a lot more. And since they didn't get a lot more, they made sure that they got some on their way back home. So here's Amaziah, the king of Judah, who in some bad decision-making has left his own people open to destruction as these Israelites make their way back into Ephraim, or northern kingdom of Israel. Going on to 2 Chronicles 25, verses 14 through 16, even though Amaziah has been given the victory over Edom, I meant Edomites. They were looking for the spoil from Edom, not from Syria. I said Syria, but it's Edom. We're going to see Amaziah's wicked ways here in 25, 14 through 16. It says, now it came about after Amaziah came from slaughtering the Edomites, that he brought the gods of the sons of Seir, set them up as his gods, bowed down before them, and burned incense to them. Now, in verse 14, why does that not logically make any sense at all? Pardon me? Yeah, but why does it make no sense to worship the gods of the Edomites?
Because they just lost.
Yeah, they just lost. The gods are losers. So you're worshiping the losers? Well, he probably figures, well, it's what those gods of the Edomites represent. All of the sinful way that I can act, and all of that. But that doesn't make it, it's not even logical.
Do we know at what point that they became idolatrous like that, where they had their own gods set up? The Edomites, that is, being of the descendants of Esau.
Yeah,
they must have adopted that.
You would have thought they would have been, as long as Esau was around, they would have still been worshiping God.
Sometime after that, they slipped off. And that would be because they've got Moabite neighbors and Edomite neighbors and all this. So, looking at Amaziah's wicked ways here in verses 14 through 16, it says, verse 15, Then the anger of the Lord burned against Amaziah, and he sent him a prophet who said to him, Why have you sought the gods of the people who have not delivered their own people from your hand? See, there's the logic. Lack of logic. Doesn't make any sense. Why are you worshiping them? They're the ones who just lost. Verse 16, it came about as he was talking with him, that the king said to him, Have we appointed you a royal counselor? Stop. Why should you be struck down? Then the prophet stopped and said, I know that God has planned to destroy you because you have done this and have not listened to my counsel. Because my counsel would be God's counsel. So those are the wicked ways of Amaziah. And then we're going to find war between Amaziah and Joash. This is Joash of Israel. We're still in 2 Chronicles. We'll look at 2 Chronicles 25, verses 17 through 24. Then Amaziah, king of Judah, took counsel. Who does he take counsel with? Just says he took counsel. Sent to Joash, the son of Joahaz, the son of Jehu, the king of Israel, saying, Come, let us face each other. So Judah is the aggressor. And Joash, the king of Israel, sent to Amaziah, king of Judah, saying, Now, just think for a moment, geographically and people-wise, what's the difference between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah? Geographically and people-wise.
Bigger.
Northern kingdom of Israel is bigger. What about people-wise?
Smaller population.
Smaller population. So you're going to take an army, and you were only able to raise up 300,000 at last count, and you're going to go against 10 tribes with one tribe, and you're not even seeking God's counsel in any of this. In fact, you've already threatened one of God's prophets, and you're going to go against them. You're going to be the aggressor. So when he comes to Amaziah, Amaziah relates a proverb to him, and it's found right here in verse 18 of 2 Chronicles 25. And Joash, the king of Israel, sent to Amaziah, king of Judah, saying, The thorn bush which was in Lebanon sent to the cedar which was in Lebanon, saying, Give your daughter to my son in marriage. And there passed by a wild beast that was in Lebanon and trampled the thorn bush. Well, the thorn bush is pretty lowly compared to the cedar in Lebanon. And so as the thorn bush was trying to command the cedar in Lebanon to do this or to do that, it got trampled in the process. Just sort of out of the blue. Verse 19 says, You said, Behold, you have defeated Edom, and your heart has become proud in your boasting. So you did defeat Edom. That's true. But you became proud in your boasting. Now stay at home, for why should you provoke trouble, that even you, should fall, and Judah with you? So he says, we'll just brush you aside like swatting a fly. And they've got the people, they've got the geography. Verse 20, but Amaziah would not listen, for it was from God that he might deliver them into the hand of Joash, because they had sought the gods of Edom. So there's the consequences of going after the gods of Edom. First of all, it didn't make any sense. Secondly, it gets the attention of God. And number three, you don't want to get the attention of God when you're dealing with a sin problem. They did. And so, God's going to intervene here. So Joash, king of Israel, went up, and he and Amaziah, king of Judah, faced each other at Beth Shemesh. Beth Shemesh. We had a fella in for the retreat, Gary Hill. I don't know if any of you have met Gary Hill. Gary is a bit overweight, sort of crippled up a bit when you see him. He walks with a cane. But he attends an archaeological dig at Beth Shemesh every year. He didn't make it this last year because he had to have hip surgery. But he and I were talking about the Beth Shemesh tell and what they're finding there. And they're finding more Canaanite material than they are finding Israelite material. The Israelites that occupied the area, the tell, which was a town, were very small in number. But the Canaanite dig is really quite productive. That's Beth Shemesh. So they faced each other at Beth Shemesh, which belonged to Judah. And Judah was defeated by Israel. Well, that's no surprise, because God, back in verse 20, was going to deliver them into the hand of Joash because they sought the gods of Edom. And they fled. Judah was defeated by Israel, and they fled each to his tent. See, we're not talking about a time of organized armies where they just say, okay, it's time to get back to the barracks, and we'll all go back to the barracks, and we'll be fortified there in the barracks, and we'll take all our equipment. No, this is warfare where it's more like National Guard, and the weapons you use are the weapons you made yourself. And so when you retreat, you just go back to your tent, go back to your house. Now it says, till they each fled to his tent. That's a term that just means they went back to their dwelling place. By this time, the Israelites, both the Judean kingdom and the Jews in the southern kingdom, were not living in tents. They had earlier lived in tents. When they conquered the promised land, they were living in tents. But as soon as they got into the housing areas, they just took over the houses that were already there. And we know what those houses look like. So, fleeing each to they've gone home.
Time to get back to work. Time to beat my sword into a plowshare and beat my spear into a pruning hook. They're an agrarian people. Agriculture is their livelihood. So they fled each to his tent. And that's brought about by God because of their going after the idols of Edom. Verse 23, then Joash, king of Israel, captured Amaziah, king of Judah, the son of Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, at Beth Shemesh, brought him to Jerusalem, tore down the wall of Jerusalem. See, this is the king of Israel, takes the king of Judah, takes him back to Jerusalem, and in the sight of the king of Judah, who is Amaziah, tears down the wall of Jerusalem from the gate of Ephraim to the corner gate, 400 cubits. And he took all the gold and silver and all the utensils which were found in the house of God, with Obed-Edom and the treasures of the king's house, the hostages also, and returned to Samaria. So a very poorly planned invasion on the part of Judah as they went into the northern kingdom of Israel. And he was told it's going to end up in defeat. So about this time, Amaziah is going to sort of fade back into the background. And he has a child by the name of Uzziah. Uzziah is going to take over the throne, so Amaziah is going to just fade away. Now, it's about this time that Joash of the northern kingdom of Israel is going to die, and that death will be found over in 2 Kings 13 and 14. And it's very typical of the wording that's been used with others. 2 Kings 13 and verse 12, the rest of the acts of Joash, all that he did, and his might with which he fought against Amaziah, king of Judah, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And also in verse 13a, Joash slept with his fathers. 2 Kings 14, verse 15, the rest of the acts of Joash, which he did, and his might, how he fought with Amaziah, king of Judah. Seems a repeat on that. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? Then it goes on to note verse 16. So Jehoash slept with his fathers, was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel. Points to remember in Joash of Israel, death of Elisha, Syria smitten only 3 times, and the war with Amaziah of Judah, in which Israel is successful. So we come to king number 14. We only got 6 to go after this one. Come to king number 14 in Israel. And this is another Jeroboam. Now remember the original first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, Jeroboam the son of Nebat. Well, this is Jeroboam the son of Joash. So we call him Jeroboam the second. Jeroboam the second. He comes to the throne in 2 Kings 13 and verse 1. The 23rd year of Joash, son of Amaziah, king of Judah. Joash, the son, let's see, like that. 2 Kings 13. Let's go 1 and 14. Second Kings 14:23. What we've got is 12 years as a co-regent, 29 years as sole king. So 2 Kings 14, verse 23. In the 15th year of Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, became king in Samaria and reigned 41 years. All of those other verses are still talking about the time of co-regency. Last 15 years in the reign of Amaziah at the bottom of the page, 2 Kings 14, verse 17. Amaziah, son of Joash, king of Judah, lived 15 years after the death of Joash, son of Jehoahaz, king of Israel. And so we are going to come to Jeroboam. And with Jeroboam, we're going to see 2 prophets, Jonah and Amos. So if you look over at page 44 of the syllabus, you'll see the start of Jeroboam's reign. And Jeroboam's actually going to be a deliverer. There was a deliverer that had been promised earlier. This is the deliverer. And his character is found in 2 Kings 14, and verse 24. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not depart from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin. And yet Israel is going to be delivered by the hand of this Jeroboam. In chapter 13 and verse 5, it says, "And the Lord gave Israel a deliverer
So they escaped from under the hand of the Arameans, and the sons of Israel lived in their tents as formerly. Again, they're living in their own housing. 2 Kings 14, verses 25 through 27, tells you a little bit more. He restored the border of Israel from the entrance of Hamath, that's to the north, as far as the sea of the Arabah, which is to the south. The Arabah is the dry down there by the Dead Sea. According to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, who was of Gath-hepher. Now, Jonah is mentioned right here in 2 Kings 14, verse 25, but you're not going to find anything outside the book of Jonah being a prophecy of Jonah. In other words, he is a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel, that he's only noted for his traveling to Nineveh. Not going to be anything about him being a prophet during the time of Jeroboam II. But one would imagine that he would be very much like one who did the work earlier, like Elijah and Elisha, as he's working in the northern kingdom of Israel. But there's nothing recorded. Just this one notation right here, that he was a prophet in the northern kingdom of Israel during the days of Jeroboam II. That's all we have. But that is the Jonah. So it's during this time that Jeroboam II is really bringing about a reclaiming of geography that had been lost through earlier wars, especially to the Syrians. Looking at 2 Kings 14:26, for the Lord saw the affliction of Israel, which was very bitter, for there was neither bond nor free, nor was there any helper for Israel. And the Lord did not say that he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Joash. Now, as I've noted for you before, God generally, when the wine press is full, jumps into the wine press, and that's the end of the nation. We will see it with the Assyrians, we'll see it with the Babylonians, we'll see it with the Persians, we'll see it with the Greeks, we'll see it with the Romans. All of those nations are gone because the wine press or wine vat was full. But God never allows, I would say for the sake of the Messianic line, never allows the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom to be absolutely destroyed. Now, they both will be taken off into separate captivities, but neither one of them will be destroyed. They will retain their identity as a people in a foreign land, and then when they're allowed to come back into the land, they'll come back in as a united people once again. Now, there's some commentators and some Bible scholars who like to say, oh, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel are the 10 lost tribes, that they never came back, but that's not true. When we get into the book of Isaiah, and we're looking at some of the passages that deal with all that, we'll see that no, they were allowed to come back into the land. All of them were, and we have some indications that in the time of Jesus, that Anna, who is in the temple, is of the tribe, if I remember correctly, of the tribe of Asher, and that's one of the northern tribes. So she's retained her tribal identity. Somebody in her family came back into the land. So Jeroboam is going to be used by God, but the spiritual condition of the kingdom, if you're looking at 2 Kings 13 and verse 6, the spiritual condition of the kingdom is not good. Nevertheless, they did not turn away from the sins of the house of Jeroboam, with which he made Israel sin, but walked in them. And the Asherah also remained standing in Samaria. Now, if you'll go ahead and put down 1 Kings 16 and verse 33, you'll find that's a reference to the time of Ahab and Jezebel fame, and the Asherah was there in Samaria at that time. So it's been there.
1 Kings 16:33.
1 Kings 16, verse 33. Let me look at that real quick, make sure that's right. Yeah, and Ahab also made the Asherah. Thus Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel than all the kings of Israel who were before him. So he's the one. His wife introduces Baal worship. She's a Sidonian princess, Jezebel. But then her husband introduces the Asherah. Old Ahab. So we come down all the way down through Israel. There's not a lot noted. We come all the way down to the 27th year of Jeroboam, and that's when we're going to take a look at Jonah and Amos. Amaziah is going to die during that time period. In 2 Kings 14, verses 18 through 20. The rest of the acts of Amaziah, they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah. They conspired against him in Jerusalem. He fled to Lachish. Lachish is another large city, large fortified city, just like Jerusalem. But they sent after him to Lachish and killed him there. Then they brought him on horses. He was buried in Jerusalem with his fathers in the city of David. So here we're having some assassinations taking place in the southern kingdom of Judah. This is within the Messianic line. And so Amaziah is slain. And you might note the points to remember. He did right, but his heart was not perfect. He defeated Edom, brought Edom's gods home. He had war with Joash. And then we're going to find his son Uzziah and sometimes he's called Azariah. You look at 2 Kings 14 and verse 21. It says, and all the people of Judah took Azariah, he's sometimes referred to as Uzziah, who was 16 years old, made him king in the place of his father Amaziah. And he's going to reign for 52 years. This is king of Judah. 2 Kings 15, verses 1 and 2. 27th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Azariah, son of Amaziah, king of Judah, became king. 16 years old and became king. He reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. His character is noted in 2 Kings 15:3. He did right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father Amaziah had done. However, if you note 2 Kings 15 verse 4, only the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So that's the spiritual condition of the kingdom. So as Jeroboam in the northern kingdom of Israel has restored the borders, got all the original territory back, and there is a prophet by the name of Jonah who is living in the northern kingdom of Israel. We then find a prophet who's living in the kingdom of Judah is commissioned by God to travel north into the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, this may all happen about the same time that Jonah is commissioned to go to Nineveh. So Jonah is commissioned to go to Nineveh. Amos is commissioned to go from Judah into the northern kingdom of Israel. He will not be well received. I guess that's a nice way of saying it. But these two prophets are contemporary. But Jonah is preaching to a Gentile people. He's preaching to the Ninevites. Amos is preaching to the Jews of the northern kingdom of Israel. So we come back here to Jonah. This is the outline that you're all familiar with, or some of you are familiar with. You all really wanted to do the one down at the bottom. Or the four-pointer there, running from God, running to God, running with God, running before God. That would have been an easy one. And now your teacher was heartless and made you do the big one. So let's take a look at Jonah. You all know the account. Quite well. Let's take a look at some things that you might not know about Jonah. And that is dealing with God's overall plan for the use of Assyria. Now, the Assyrians are a people who are really the cruelest of the cruel. If you want to take a people among ancient nations that would get a cruel badge, the Assyrians would be it. And I don't know if I have it here on my this computer. Let me see if I do. But I've got some information on Assyrians. Assyrians and the Assyrians and the Babylonians are very much alike. They're virtually kissing cousins. They speak the same language. Their art form is pretty much the same thing. And they live in the northern area of Iraq. They are around from the 9th to the 6th century BC. And this is on the map is the Assyrian Empire. And you can see, or maybe you can't see, but you might note that we have Babylon down here and Nineveh up here. And when you're in Iraq, this is up here in Nineveh, that's Mosul. And of course, Babylon is a dig. Both of those are just digs today. But here's the Assyrian Empire of the 9th century. It says BCE. Sorry, the map says that. But that's 9th century BC. And that's the movement of the Assyrians. The Assyrians come all the way down and expand the borders all the way down. They take over the old Babylonian Empire. That's the Babylonian Empire of Hammurabi. They take over that. And they come all the way down into Judah and Jerusalem. And someone was talking the other day, was it a lesson somebody was giving, I don't remember, about Sennacherib and Hezekiah. Hezekiah, in the annals of Sennacherib, he said, I shut up Hezekiah as a bird in a cage. And we have that particular item in a museum. And the chariots and infantry, and they were pretty well standardized in their equipment by this time. So we're starting to look at armies that are just a little bit more professional than earlier armies. And this is Ashurbanipal II and siege warfare. And so he's standing at a bit of a distance. You'll notice he has a shield bearer right there, and a fellow who holds his arrows for him, and also holds a shield, and that's so that the king won't be hit by a loosed arrow at that distance. And this is a siege machinery. There's a long pole that comes out of this unit that's moved forward on rollers. And they move it towards the wall on rollers, and they have men up inside of it. It's a piece of siege machinery. And most of the walls were made out of mud brick. And so what they do is they have a ram that has a chisel edge on it. And they pull the ram back and bang it into the wall, and then they twist it. And they get it lodged in there between some of those mud bricks, and they just start prying those mud bricks out. Then they pull it back, ram it again, the same place. You can see how they're knocking down a corner there of that wall, and eventually they'll have a hole in that wall. And of course they're protected from arrows and from most everything else. Many times these siege machines would be leather covered, and they would have water on the siege machine itself, and they'd pour water over the side and get the hides all wet, and that's to keep anybody from throwing a torch or something like that, getting this thing caught on fire. And that's early Assyrian cavalry. You'll notice no stirrups, no saddles. They're riding bareback, and that is not uncommon. That's the way horses, there's bridles, but there's no stirrups or saddle.
No shoes?
And no horseshoes.
No, for them.
And no shoes for them either. They didn't have any shoes, and the horses didn't have any shoes. Horseshoes are more modern invention. That's why among ancients you have to be careful where you run your horses. That's why you don't run your horse over rocky ground. And this is Tiglath-Pileser III. This is late 8th century. And these are all from funerary items, so these are very, very accurate. You note that the one rider there has the skin of an animal, but with the hoofs still on the skin, draped over the back of the horse, and that's what he's riding on. But he's still bareback. And of course, a person who's really good with horses doesn't even really need the bridle. They can just guide the horse with their knees. And again, some more of the Assyrians. The armor that's used right there, the guy right there in the center is a slinger. And all of this is fairly standardized equipment by this time and provided by the government. You'll note that if you can see it, there's bands on the helmet, brass bands on the helmet. That's a indication of his rank. The more bands, it's just like sergeant stripes on the uniform. The more bands, the higher ranking soldier he would have been. And this is Sennacherib at Lachish. This is right before he goes after the Jews at Jerusalem. These would be military advisors. You note the fancy boots and the fancy leggings. These are all accurate as far as coloration is concerned. And you'll notice that they have beards that are curled. The Assyrians, along with the Babylonian men, wore their hair long and curled their hair with curling irons. That'd be the old kind of curling irons where you put it in the fire and get it warmed up. You don't want to get it too hot, or just the hair goes poof. But they knew how to do it. So they did not have naturally curly hair, but they had curly hair because of their curling their hair. And all of this, the fan, the servants there in the back are fanning, and they're really not fanning, keeping cool. They're fanning the flies off of it. Flies are just really pretty much in abundance. I tell people the first morning I woke up in New Zealand, those New Zealanders, when we were there, had their windows wide open, didn't have screens on windows because that was too costly. And I woke up that first morning, looked at the ceiling, counted 26 flies on the ceiling. So all the time I was in New Zealand, I walked around with a fly swarm. Loads of bread and crazy. But just some more Assyrian troops in Babylon. And that's typical of the area around Babylon, is that it's swampy area. And so malaria was always a problem among ancients in the swampy area. Lots of people died from malaria. Again, you can see this is the royal garrison, and this, again, the coloration, the method, the type of dress, the wearing of boots. Of course, they all ancient soldiers wore skirts because the wearing of a skirt allowed you more freedom of movement. But you'll note right here that they're wearing boots, and this is very unusual among ancients. They usually went into battle barefooted, or in the case of Romans, had sandals. You can see the bands around the helmet. The conical type helmet is very typically Assyrian. The problem is when you get down to the Babylonians, they pretty much look the same. Again, the coloration right here, and everything you see is completely accurate. It's been taken off of tombs and funerary items, things like that. And this is a heavy chariot, the reign of Beneful. These guys are moving along probably at a real fast pace of maybe 10 miles an hour, a gallon. And you have 2 shield bearers and an archer, plus a driver. So that gives you a little bit of an idea as to what the Assyrian people are like, and that's what you're going to see when you're dealing with Jonah. Yes.
I love that you know all this stuff. Where can I know all this stuff too? Where do you go for your? I mean, I know.
It's a big secret.
Dave,
There is a publication company called Osprey. Osprey. It's out of Great Britain. Osprey. O-S-P-R-E. They're like the bird. Osprey.
Okay.
So look up Osprey Publications. When you look up Osprey Publications, they will have colored plates in volumes and volumes and
those are
volumes.
history books.
They'll go all the way from Operation Desert Storm all the way back to Egypt. Armies, soldiers, weapons.
That's where you got all those pictures at?
Yep, Osprey Publications.
O-S-P-R-I-N-G.
O-S-P-R-E-Y.
It's ospreypublishing.com.
It's out of Great Britain.
Dave, were they still practicing champion combat at this time, like what we see in the time of David and Goliath,
No,
that had fallen out of style?
yeah. Yeah, when you're dealing with Assyrians, they just say, get out of the way, we're going to grind you into the ground. That's pretty much the Assyrian attitude, what's going to happen. And by the way, especially when we get to the Persians, you'll see that with the Persians, they were very colorful. The Persians all wore lots of yellow and purple. Their infantrymen wore yellow and purple. And you could see them way, way off in the distance. And that's what they wanted. They don't want to blend with the geography. They want to be seen. So if they were to wear something that blended with the geography, they'd want to change out into something really bright. Now that use of bright colors, of course, comes all the way down into colonial times, both in Europe and in this country. And it's only with the American woodsman that he decides it's going to be a little bit easier to get those redcoats out there, those lobster backs that are marching down, and they're marching in route formation. They're not marching in step, but they usually have a drummer and a fife player, and here they are marching. You're coming back from Lexington and Concord after trying to find the gunpowder that was stored up there, coming back to Boston, and the colonists are wearing clothing that just blends in with the woods, and they just fire on them, and then they run down the road through the woods, and they load up, and then they fire again, and the redcoats are just falling all over the place, and they're easy targets, but that coloration of maintaining color was designed to instill fear into the enemy. There's all these guys coming, especially with the British who used the bayonet. And remember, you go fire, they have a Brown Bess musket, not a rifle. They have a Brown Bess musket. And muskets are not accurate, they're not rifled. And so you have to get real close. So they get real close and fire a volley. Sometimes they fire different volleys where they would drop down and the rank behind them would fire a volley, and then they'd move back and the other rank would move forward and they'd fire a volley. But they're real close to one another. But they also, the British were very much into fixing bayonets and charging. And Europeans and, everybody they faced when they were in their heyday were really afraid of them. But they weren't disguised. You could see them. And their officers sat up on horseback, and they were not disguised. But the Americans would have none of that. So they'd start picking off their officers, and so, that red coat makes a pretty good target. The Persians were the same way. The Romans didn't disguise any of their movements. They were pretty much that way. And so when you look at coloration of ancients, you say, why in the world are they so brightly colored? Those to instill fear in the opposing force. So Jonah is going to go to Nineveh. Nineveh is going to one day end up being the capital of the Assyrian Empire. At the time that Jonah goes, it is not the capital of the Assyrian Empire. You'll find commentators and you'll find individuals who are writing about Nineveh, and they'll say, well, Jonah went to the capital city of the Assyrian Empire. No, he went to a city that would become a capital city, but it was not a capital city. But God knew that it was one day going to be a capital city. And so Jonah is sent there. And so you've got this chart, Jonah, go ye into all the world right here. And again, the key subject is Jonah, and then going to Nineveh. And we have the outline. We'll use this outline back here to note. There's that one right here. The book of Jonah is somewhere in the 800 to 740 BC period. And what we know of Assyrian government is that in the Assyrian history, from 810 to 746 was a period of weakness. During this period of weakness, the nation was starting to fall apart. And we have it in their annals, we have it in their writings, the things are just disintegrating. However, things will pick up later on, and they will then become that great world power that will come down and take the northern kingdom of Israel off into Assyrian captivity. But at this time, they are not the great world empire. They're having lots of problems at home. And so when we look at the capital of Assyria, you might note that the capital from the 14th century to the 9th century is a city called Ashur, A-S-S-H-U-R, Ashur. From the 14th century to the 9th century, it's Ashur. And the second capital is a city called Calah, C-A-L-A-H. Sometimes it's referred to as Nimrud, N-I-M-R-U-D, Nimrud. And it's the capital from the 9th century to the 7th century. So actually, Calah, or Nimrud, is the capital when Jonah goes to Nineveh. So he's not being sent to the capital city. And then Nineveh will become the capital from 705 to 612 BC. 705 to 612. So Jonah is there somewhere between 800 and 740. So he's there a number of years before Nineveh becomes the capital of the nation of Assyria.
And that was from 712 to 705. We see the
705 to 612. 612, 614 is the date for the fall of Nineveh by the Babylonians. The Babylonians will come in and destroy the Assyrians. Now you might ask, and it's a little bit of an easier thing to figure out, well, why was he sent to Nineveh? Why was he not sent to Calah? Well, God wants, see, Assyria is getting to the point where the wine vat's filling up. And so God is going to forestall the filling of the wine vat by sending a prophet there. He already knows that the people are going to repent. Jonah doesn't like it, but that's exactly what God's plan is. And so Jonah is sent to Nineveh. Nineveh is receptive. Nineveh will repent. And that will prolong the life of Assyria. If the life of Assyria is not prolonged, and God in His justice has to destroy Assyria, then the plan, and of course God's plan never fails, but the plan would then be messed up, because what nation would be used for the taking of the northern kingdom of Israel off into captivity? So it's all fitting together. This is all within the plan of God, that Nineveh will repent, the Assyrian Empire will be extended. It was on life support. It'll come off of life support for a while longer, until Nineveh becomes the capital, and the Assyrians take the northern kingdom of Israel off into Assyrian captivity. So it's easy for us to look back on all of that happening that way. It would be extremely difficult for us living at that time. And if you were a knowledgeable Jew and you said, now, why's Jonah been sent to Nineveh? Nineveh's not the capital. The capital is Calah. Well, it's easier for us to look back and say, that's why he was sent. It seems to be obvious. Jonah's name means dove. And when you're looking at a dove, you naturally think of, what do we think of when we think of a dove? Peace. He's not a very peaceful character. He can get aggravated, and he doesn't just get aggravated with the Assyrians. He's already aggravated with them because they're Gentiles. But he gets aggravated with God, and he's not very pleased with all of that that's taking place. Now, when we come after our midterm and we come back to Jonah, I'll just be introducing Jonah today. I'll show you a little bit about Phoenician ships and what Phoenician ships were like at that particular time. So that'll give you a good idea as to what kind of ship he would have been on when he tried to sail across the Mediterranean. And of course, the Phoenicians sailed across the Mediterranean all the time. They didn't run coasters. Coaster is a ship that follows the coastline, but they just sailed right out into the open water, away from the side of the land, and they were good navigators, and that's why they were commercial giants among the ancients. So his name means dove. He, as the writer of the book, is referred to as the son of Amittai. That's all it notes in Jonah 1, verse 1, and 2 Kings 14, verse 25. And there's no definite claim anywhere that the book was written by Jonah, but that doesn't mean that Jonah didn't write it. But tradition holds that Jonah is the writer. And by the way, there is a tradition among the Iraqis who live in Mosul that Jonah stayed there in that area where Nineveh was located and never went back to the northern kingdom of Israel. And they say that his tomb is there in northern Iraq today. tradition. Good one.
ISIS actually blew it up.
You what?
ISIS blew that up.
ISIS blew that up.
Actually,
Don't know why they did, because ISIS has been already been in Mosul.
yeah, it was, I think a couple months ago, it was on the news, and Jonah's tomb was destroyed.
Probably dug up the body of Jonah and beheaded him.
Dave, what was the Second Kings reference again?
The Second Kings
1425?
1425. So Jonah is a real person who lived in the time of Jeroboam II. We've already seen that. And he is the son of Amaziah. And he is going to go from Gath Hefer, and we'll come back to that. But he's going to go to Nineveh. So that's where he's told that he needs to make his destination. So when you're looking at Jonah's commission, disobedience, and punishment, 1 through 16, you start out with the commission in flight in chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. So the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, Rise, go to Nineveh, the great city, even though Asher, or even though Calah really is the capital at this time, and cry against them, for their wickedness has come up before me. So Jonah, verse 3, rose up to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. So he went down to Joppa, and that's the modern day port of Haifa, if you want a point of reference, Haifa. So he went down to Joppa, found a ship which was going to Tarshish, paid the fare, went down into it to go with them to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. And Tarshish is over on the shore of modern-day Spain. And I'm just trying to think. I was thinking it was over on the western shore, but it may be on the eastern shore. That would be no problem for Phoenicians. Phoenicians could sail up past what will be referred to later as the Gates of Hercules. Gates of Hercules is the Strait of Gibraltar. And so the Phoenicians, we know the Phoenicians sailed out because they colonized over on the east coast, on the west coast of Africa. They colonized that section of the Atlantic, and they also moved their way up the coast of modern-day Spain and put colonies in there. So for them to be over there and past the Strait of Gibraltar, ships normally didn't go through the Strait of Gibraltar because then you're out in the Atlantic Ocean. But the Phoenicians did that. Let me just stop here for a minute. Let me see if I've got my thing.
Dave, did you give us a year for Jonah?
Yeah, 800 to 740 BC. None of Jonah will be on the midterm test.
It's a wider range than normal.
The what?
It's a pretty wide range.
60 years.
Yeah, it is.
Have any way to narrow that down?
Probably not.
We can ask them.
What about the Navy?
Okay, looking at Phoenician vessels. This is approximately what the vessel would look like. You see from the men who are standing near the bow and in the stern. that they aren't very large. They all had a figurehead of some mythical creature on the front. And the fellow who is a steersman there in the back is using sideboards. This is before the invention of a single rudder. And there are boards that went over the side, and they were connected by a central system that he would move back and forth. And so the sideboards would steer the vessel by turning those boards. And you can see the sideboard there. Let's see if I can give you a better. You can see the sideboard back there on the stern in that particular drawing. But the sideboards are called steer boards. So that's where you get the term starboard from. You have right side and left side. Port is left and starboard is right in nautical terms. I'm not telling you Navy guys anything you don't already know. But this is where the word starboard came from. It came from the term steerboard on these ships. You see in that particular drawing the ballast that's in the bottom, all the stones that are in the bottom. And these are a fairly broad-beamed, very, very seaworthy ship. There you can see the steer boards there on the back, and of course a single sail, and oars when they would need oars, which would be if you ever got into if you ever becalmed. That's always the fear of any sailor sailing with sails, is that you run into where there's no wind. If there's no wind, then you have to get the oars out and try to find some wind. That's one that's just been rebuilt. And so it's a replica of, you can see the size of individuals with that. This is the construction of that. It's all done with fitted boards and pegs. No nails used in the construction. There you can see how broad a beam it is as they're building it. And some of the inner workings of all of that. So you can see the size of it, not very large. Single sail. Quite a large sail, really.
Anyway, that's vessels. That's what they look like. Okay. I think we'll stop right there.